We've been talking about the preparation for making the spiritual exercises and the first opening movements of entering into that time of readying oneself for that journey. And when someone comes to see me and asks to make the spiritual exercises and we embark on that journey together, one of the things that I always invite them to do is to pray their story, to pray the blessed story of their life with God, to really spend time with that story. And for me, it's an incredible privilege to be able to witness, to have that window into the way that God has been at work in that person's life. And for that person, it's often a deeply, deeply consoling experience as they look back and start to see how God's love and light is woven through their life experience and their life story like a golden thread. Praying one's faith story, one's life journey with God is very important, and I think I want to just lead us through 4 ways in which that is important. I think the first thing to notice is that each of our stories is unique. It is the only one of those stories that has ever been or will ever be. No one has lived the exact experience and journey of my life. So it is my particular story, my particular unfolding with God. It's also sacred. It's holy ground. It's sacred because we meet God, we encounter Christ in the events and the circumstances that make up our daily lives and that make up the experience of our unfolding journey. Ignatius believed that God is to be found in all things, and that God is to be found precisely in the experience of our life journey, in its joys, in its struggles, in its messiness, in every facet of it. Praying one's life journey is also often a very healing experience. There can be parts of our lives that we don't really understand or know how to make sense of, parts of our lives that may have been extraordinarily painful. And to be able to spend time with God, looking at those experiences, those moments in my life, with Him and through His eyes, I often start to understand in new ways how those things have shaped me and formed me and are an important part of my life journey. And there's also a sense of finding healing in that compassionate, loving presence of God with me in those moments as I recognize that, sometimes for the first time. It's also a really helpful thing to do in terms of discerning the way forward in my life journey. So as I look back over the journey of my life and see the way that God has been at work in it and the threads that are there and the way that things have unfolded in the past, it gives me a clue as to how God might be at work right now in my life experience and where God may be leading me and inviting me as I move forward in my journey. So we are shaped profoundly by the events and the circumstances of our lives. If we look at the life of Ignatius, as we have been journeying with him, we can see how he was shaped and formed in a multitude of different ways. Simple things like the fact that he was the last of 13 children, and had to be sent off to earn his keep at court from a very young age, which exposed him to a particular milieu, a place where he learnt the values of chivalry and of court life, which we can see infused into the imagery of the spiritual exercises later on. And in particular, that moment when his life changed, that moment when he experienced that cannonball that injured him so badly that we saw change the entire course of the unfolding of his life journey. So the various things that happen in our lives somehow shape who we become, and they are part of our unfolding journey with God. We don't choose a lot of the aspects of our lives. We don't choose where we're born. We don't choose when we are born, into which era or which time. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose our genes. So much of our life world is a world that we are born into, that we live into. I want to share with you 3 different aspects of my own life journey with God, my own story, and the way in which, as I look back, I see them interwoven with the golden thread of the God presence in my life. I was born into a family in which my grandparents on my father's side were Scottish Presbyterian, very devout, very involved in their community. My grandfather was an elder in the Presbyterian church. And on the other side, on my mother's side, my grandparents were Anglican and Catholic. And they too were very involved in their churches. And I grew up Catholic and was sent to a Catholic school. But I was also invited by my grandparents to come with them to church on many Sundays. And that was part of my growing up, being exposed to a wide variety of ways of practicing Christian faith and coming to see the beauty and the value and the specialness of them. I was born into a society in the early 1970s in South Africa that was at the height of the apartheid era. I was born into a system of grave injustice as a white person, as one of those who were oppressing people of color, black people in our society. And with all the media censorship, I grew up sheltered from understanding that reality for most of my growing up years until I went to university. I knew that we had legal segregation, that whites and blacks were not allowed to be in the same areas. We had separate buses, separate schools, separate churches, separate recreational facilities. The only people of color that I ever met were working as laborers in the white areas or as servants in white households. And that was the only reality that I had been exposed to. It was only when I went to university at the age of 18 and I joined the Catholic student movement there, and I became friends with some black students who were part of that Catholic student movement as well, that I, for the first time in my life, began to understand something of the impact of the reality of the system that I grew up in and that I was part of by virtue of having been born when and where I was. And I was drawn into an understanding, some understanding, of what people had lived through and were still living through. And that Catholic student movement was a place of activism and a struggle for justice. And I became aware as I journeyed with the people in that community of how faith and life are interconnected, how they are inseparable. And I became part of that community working towards a more just environment. At the same time, I became more and more interested in and wanting to deepen my relationship with God. The Catholic student movement of which I was a part had Jesuits as chaplains, Jesuits who were the first followers of Ignatius in that company of Jesus, the companions of Jesus that he founded that later became known as Jesuits. And so I became exposed to that Ignatian heritage at that time as well. I would hear people talking about the spiritual exercises, and I was intrigued. I heard people talking about spiritual accompaniment. And I asked a lot of questions and went to the library and looked up different things about the life of Ignatius. I found it something that was utterly compelling for me. At one point, I went to a student conference and there was a workshop there on prayer. And there was a Jesuit from Britain who happened to be out, and he offered this workshop on prayer in which he talked a little bit about the spiritual exercises. And I was so intrigued and so drawn by what he shared that I went to him afterwards and said, could I make the spiritual exercises? And he looked at me and he said, I suppose so. I don't see any reason why not. And so I went back to the student community of which I was a part, and I went and I knocked on the door of the Jesuit there who was the chaplain, and I said, I want to make the spiritual exercises. I found out that I, as a layperson, can make them. And he looked at me and he said, well, how old are you now? And I said, I'm 18. And he said, well, you're a bit young. Why don't you wait a little bit? It's such an important experience, and come back when you're a little bit older. And so I waited, and I waited what felt like a long time, but was probably about 3 months or so. And then I went and knocked on his door again, and I said, I'm a bit older now, and I really want to make the spiritual exercises. And he said, let's engage in this, let's talk about it. And so I look back and I see 3 strands. The strands of my ecumenical experience growing up as a child, the strand of being born into the apartheid struggle and only really coming to a real understanding of what was happening as a university student, and the strand of encountering Ignatius in the early years at university. And I see how they impacted the unfolding of the next part of my life. Because when I had made the spiritual exercises, there was such a powerful and life-transforming experience for me that all I wanted for the rest of my life was to share the heritage of Ignatius, to offer it to as many people as possible. And I discovered that as I began to do that, having been trained, that I was being drawn into situations in which more and more people from different church traditions were coming and asking to make the spiritual exercises. That there was really an interest that went far outside of the Catholic community that I was part of. Methodists, Anglicans, Baptists, Congregationalists, all these different traditions, evangelical churches, people were hungry for the wisdom of Ignatius, and I felt at home because of the experience that I had had as a child. And then as we began to take the spiritual exercises into the township communities where Black people had suffered horrifically under the apartheid regime, and it was just as apartheid was ending, it gave me a deep sense of fulfillment and of feeling that there was something very important going on here when we were able to offer these Ignatian ways of praying and to hear people talk about the healing, the profound healing that they experienced of the trauma that they had endured in that time and the way that their image of God and their image of self had been impacted. And I saw that other strand link in so powerfully. And so I think that there is a deep sense that God is constantly at work in our lives, that there is a weaving going on, that there is something that sometimes we cannot see in the moment, that we can only see when we look back at our experience and we notice in the looking back how God has been at work in and through the circumstances of our lives, how we have been shaped and formed. More recently, the experience that we have lived through of the pandemic shifted the way that life was unfolding, and we began to share the spiritual exercises and to teach people about the exercises on Zoom using different ways of connecting in a way that we would never have imagined would be possible before. And that too has been part of the unfolding of how my vocational life has grown and developed. It's almost as though our lives are a kind of mosaic of these different experiences. And when we are able to see them with God's eyes, when we can look at them from a distance, we start to see how those different colors and shapes come together in a very profound and powerful way. Often when people are invited to pray with their faith story, to look back over their life with God, and I encourage them to take time over this, to really sit and ask God to show them the unfolding of their life story, to walk with God along the path of their life and to invite God to show them things that God has seen that they might not have noticed. And as they do that, there is a really powerful sense that people become aware of how God has been present to them in ways that they might not otherwise have seen before. But people often say to me, well, I didn't meet Christ, or I didn't get to know about God even until I was an adult, until much later in my life. So there's no point in going back before then, because that's when I encountered God first. And that's when my life of faith started. That may have been when my explicit awareness of God first happened. That was when I maybe first came to belief or first had an experience of God that I can identify. But God didn't create us right back in our mother's womb and then somehow disappear or hide until we came to the point in which we had an experience or a knowing about Him and then kind of come back into our lives. God stays present to us at every moment of our lives, whether we're aware of it or not aware of it. And it's particularly powerful often when we haven't been aware of it, when we look back right to the very beginning and allow ourselves to see that unfolding, that we can notice how God was present even if I didn't consciously have any knowledge of God at that time. Because God is faithful and God is present to us in every moment of our life experience. God is with us in the blessings. God is with us in the gifts. If we think about the life of Ignatius, there were some moments that were real standout highlight moments. That moment at Manresa, in fact, there were a number of experiences, a number of moments. But those moments when Ignatius experienced the eyes of his understanding being opened, when he had a powerful sense of God, so powerful that he battled to find words to even begin to articulate that experience. An experience that changed the way that he saw God, the way that he saw himself. The experience that he had at La Storta, when he and his companions were on their way to Rome. And he has this experience of the Father placing him with the Son and being able for the first time to really have a sense of union with Jesus, of being one with him, of entering into that shared compassion. In our own lives too, there are moments that are particularly profound experiences of God very often, and it's important to just be aware of them, to notice them, to savor them. When I think back of my own life, I know that, when I think of some of those moments, one of them was in the midst of making the exercises in the 30-day retreat when I was in a beautiful chapel in the retreat centre in North Wales, and there was a raging storm going on outside. It was wind and just so much movement outside, and yet inside the chapel it was so quiet, so still. There was a calmness that just pulled me in to a very, very deep space. And I had a sense of God saying, I am the center of your life. Let me be the center of your life. I recall key moments of the sense of call to share Ignatian spirituality, of the moment when I was invited to take the step into a vowed life as a single woman dedicated to God. Those are the kind of big picture moments. But they're also the ordinary kind of everyday moments, the moments of just the love of travel, the enjoyment of languages, my love of dance and theatre and music, and finding God in those everyday moments and blessings of friendship and family gatherings. And so as we look back over our life story, we may pick up those moments that God is with us in the joys, in the moments of ordinary, beautiful experiences of our lives. They are gifts of God to us. And as you look back over your life story, I wonder if you can kind of try and identify or notice some of how God has been with you in the joys, in the moments for which you are most deeply grateful. Sometimes those moments are not always just the moments of joy or ease. They can be challenging. One moment that I recall very strongly was the time in which my father was dying after a diagnosis of cancer, in which he died very, very quickly 2 weeks later. But in that time, although there was enormous grief over his dying, there was more than that, a deep sense of gratitude for the profound healing that had happened in my relationship with him over the previous 2 years. The gratitude for the way that God was at work in and through that healing experience. And then God is also with us in the moments of crisis, the moments of struggle, where we really sometimes can't make sense of things, sometimes where our whole life's path unfolds in a totally different way than we expected. Ignatius, of course, had his cannonball moment at Pamplona, and the very difficult and painful and quite traumatic convalescence, at least that first part afterwards, when it was thought that he would probably die, when he was in enormous pain, when he was going through a very long period of trying to heal physically and emotionally from the impact of that experience. And we know that that moment completely changes the way that his life unfolds. In our own lives, we also have moments a bit like that. I remember that the moment in which I was told that my father was going to be leaving our family and that my parents were divorcing, and that was an absolute shattering moment for me. I was devastated. And yet, that moment, for all of the grief that there was, led me into my own spiritual accompaniment experience, my own experience of therapy as a way of trying to heal. And those in turn led me to train as a therapist and as someone who did spiritual accompaniment. And I don't think that I would have discovered those gifts and that calling, that vocation, had I not gone through that particular experience in which my life was pulled apart in that particular way. Another experience that was a profoundly difficult experience of suffering was in my early 20s. I lost 5 of my friends in the period of 6 months. One of them died by suicide, 3 of them died in the same motor vehicle accident, and one of them was brutally raped and murdered. And that combination of experiences pushed me into a place of depression and a huge struggle with wondering where God had been in that experience. I couldn't make sense of it. These were young, vibrant, wonderful people, people who I spent my days with, who I shared stories with, who I did life with. And suddenly I had lost so many of them. But I think there too, when I was able to look back later at that part of my story and to ask God, to say, God, where were you? What was happening? Why could I not feel your presence in that moment? Why did this have to happen? It wasn't so much that I got answers, but I had a real sense of God allowing me to know that God had been with me and had been grieving alongside me, consoling me and grieving with me. And there was a sense then of being able to experience God even in that darkness. And I know now that when I accompany others in places of immense pain, and when I try to hold the light at the end of the tunnel for them when they cannot see it, I know what the experience is like to feel like one is looking at a dark tunnel and one cannot see the glimmer of light that lies at the end of it. When we think about some of the experiences of looking for where God is with us in suffering, and when we battle to have a sense of where God was present, those are what Ignatius often would call experiences of spiritual desolation, feeling as though we don't know where God is, we can't access God, we feel like God is distant. And Jesus himself had that experience on the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? If you think of that very much used story of the footprints in the sand, that story where a person is in dialogue with God and says, and I look back over the story of my life, I see that there were 2 sets of footprints, you were walking alongside me, but why at the most painful and difficult experiences of my life was there only 1 set of footprints? And God's response, my child, it was then that I carried you. So God with us in the joys and the blessings, God with us in the moments of crisis, of shattering, of struggle, of suffering, and God with us in life's detours. All of our lives involve some kind of detours. Anyone who knows me will tell you that I have an absolutely non-existent sense of direction. And it's a real blessing that I was born into the era of GPS, because without GPS I would be lost even more of the time than I currently am. But Ignatius in his life goes on a lot of detours, and he eventually kind of fine-tunes his GPS. He starts to become more aware of being able to notice the signals of where God is leading him, is moving him, and to be able to follow those leadings, those instructions of that interior GPS. If you think about, for example, the experience in Ignatius's life when initially he feels that God is inviting him to go to the Holy Land, inviting him to stay there and to minister there and to spend his life in the holy places where Jesus walked. And he's really drawn to that in a very profound way. And of course, as we know, he's not able to stay because the Franciscans refuse to allow him to do so. They say that he will be excommunicated if he tries to stay. And he recognizes that this can't be God's will, because it's not something that is now possible. So he has to think again. Maybe this isn't God's invitation. Maybe this isn't in fact God's call. Maybe God's invitation is to something else. And he starts to grapple with that and to wonder about where God might be calling him, and eventually gets drawn into that thing of wanting to help souls and to train and to study in order to be able to be allowed to do so with freedom. In my own life, one of my detour kind of experiences was that I had a very strong sense as a person in the last years of my high school life that I wanted to be a professional ballet dancer. That was what I put my heart and my soul and my mind and all of my free time, my free hours into. And in the year in which I left school, I took a gap year to really focus on trying to get into a professional ballet company. And at the end of that time, when I went to audition after audition and didn't get a place, and I could see that I wasn't even in the top 50% of the people who were auditioning, I had to finally accept that this could not be what God's invitation was for me, that there must be something else. And yet so much of that discipline, that learning, that focus that was part of that time is something that is a gift that God allowed me to take with me into the places into which God has invited me since. And so the detours are often moments where we learn things along the way. Ignatius learned to discern more finely as he got things wrong, as he kind of worked out that sometimes things that he thought were God's invitation, things that he thought were for the good, were actually the bad spirit trying to kind of derail him. And that learning is something that he passes on to us now so that we can perhaps discern more quickly and more easily what is the voice of God, where are we being invited and drawn. And so, finally, God is in our life story as a kind of golden thread. That experience of God, I like to think of it as this golden thread that weaves through our life journey. And sometimes we may have to turn over the tapestry to look for the golden thread, but it's always there. That golden thread is always part of the tapestry of our life. And so, we want to look back and to ask God to show us how God has been at work in our life all along that unfolding journey. How God has been leading, nudging, drawing us into this deeper relationship with God's self that has brought us to the place that we are as we begin to do it. And that awareness really helps us as we look towards the future, as we start to try and see the little clues, the invitations, the things that pop up again and again. And as we look and we notice those, we can start to think, gosh, I wonder if God is saying something to me in that pattern, in the repetition of what keeps happening, what keeps unfolding. And we start to take seriously things that we might not have given real attention to if we hadn't really sat down to notice deeply where God is in the circumstances, events, and unfolding of our lives. And so I would invite you to take some time with your own life story, to sit with God, to look back at it, and to ask God to show you the golden thread of God's faithful presence in every moment of your life story.
Christ for me is humanity fully expressed. And as I engage Christ, he helps me to engage more deeply my own humanity in all its fullness.
A discovery of Christ leads us to truly encounter ourselves Because as Saint Teresa of Avila tells us, God knowledge is self-knowledge, and self-knowledge is God knowledge. That when we encounter Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, hopefully that encounter helps us to discover the truth within ourselves. It helps us to face who we really are, and not just face who we really are, but live out of who we deeply are. In other words, we recognize our own potential and we're able to live from that potential.
The discovery of Christ helps us to discover ourselves, because as we grow in that relationship, it's almost as though it evokes different parts of our inner world that then come into conversation and dialogue and are given more space. We become aware of parts of ourselves that we might not otherwise have discovered had it not been for that engagement and dialogue with Christ, who kind of opens up new parts of ourselves.